Everything you are most proud of either hurt the people you represent or never happened at all. That was the line Senator John Kennedy finally placed in front of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez after 12 minutes of systematically dismantling the very achievements she herself had chosen to defend. She opened her mouth, searched for an answer, glanced toward the Democrats seated near her, and discovered something far more damaging than another Republican attack. Nobody on her own side seemed eager to step into the wreckage. That was what made the moment so brutal. Kennedy had not walked into the room carrying 3 accusations and forced them onto her. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had supplied the list herself confidently, publicly, and without hesitation. She had selected the Green New Deal, her opposition to Amazon, and her broader fight for Medicare for all and working families as the evidence that 7 years in Congress had produced something worth defending. 12 minutes later, Kennedy was preparing to use those same 3 answers as a measuring stick, and the distance between the rhetoric and the results was about to become impossible to hide. Only minutes earlier, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had looked completely comfortable delivering the familiar argument about inequality, billionaires, working families, rent, economic pressure, and a political system, she said, was tilted toward people with money and influence. Democratic members listened. Cameras stayed fixed on her. She finished with the confidence of someone operating inside territory she had occupied for years, because this was the language that had built her national profile and turned ordinary committee appearances into viral clips. Kennedy did not challenge that opening speech directly. He did not waste time competing with her volume or trying to manufacture a theatrical confrontation before the substance arrived. Instead, he asked what appeared to be an almost harmless question. After 7 years in Congress, what had she actually done for the people who had sent her there? Not what she had proposed, not what she had said, but what she considered her most important accomplishments. Ocasio-Cortez treated the question like an invitation because she had answered veriflay, and nothing about Kennedy's tone suggested that the answer itself was about to become the structure of the entire examination. Her first answer was the Green New Deal, which she described as an ambitious climate and economic justice framework designed to match the scale of the crisis she believed the country faced. Kennedy wrote it down carefully on a yellow legal pad, not interrupting, not arguing, and not giving away where he intended to take the discussion once she had committed herself to the claim. Her second answer was Amazon, specifically her opposition to the proposed New York headquarters deal that she portrayed as a refusal to let one of the world's most powerful corporations purchase favorable treatment through billions of dollars in incentives. Kennedy wrote that down as well, giving the answer the same deliberate attention as though he were building a record rather than conducting a debate. Her third answer was broader and politically familiar: Medicare for all, student debt relief, and the claim that she had spent her time fighting for working families instead of billionaires. Kennedy recorded it before telling her to hold on to those 3 answers, because they would return to them. Then came a smaller number 1 that Ocasio-Cortez had used for years as proof that her political operation was fundamentally different from traditional Washington fundraising. Kennedy asked about the size of her average donation, and she answered $18 with obvious pride, because small dollar fundraising had become part of her identity and part of the argument that her campaign belonged to ordinary supporters rather than wealthy interests. Kennedy repeated the number slowly, almost casually, but the shift was immediate. The conversation was no longer simply about ideals, legislation, or political branding, because he was moving directly toward the money supplied by people who believe those ideals. He told her that before the hearing was finished, he intended to show where those $18 contributions had gone. For the first time, the exchange stopped looking like a comfortable platform for rehearsed talking points. Ocasio-Cortez had spent years using the small donation as a moral contrast between herself and the political establishment, and Kennedy was about to test whether the spending behind that symbol matched the image attached to it. He returned first to the Green New Deal, the first accomplishment she had voluntarily placed at the top of her list, and he framed the issue in the most unforgiving way possible: cost versus outcome. Kennedy cited an estimate of $93 trillion over 10 years and translated that enormous figure into something a household could understand, arguing that the burden would amount to roughly $70,000 per household in the first year. That comparison was designed to strip the proposal of its grand language and put it beside the income of an ordinary family, because a trillion-dollar argument can sound abstract while a household bill immediately becomes personal. Ocasio-Cortez responded that the Green New Deal was a non-binding resolution and therefore did not itself authorize spending, a technically important distinction that Kennedy immediately turned against the political sales pitch surrounding it. If the resolution itself cost nothing because it did nothing directly, Kennedy's argument was simple and vicious. Either the transformation being promised had an enormous eventual cost, or the document being celebrated as an achievement had produced no enforceable result at all. That was the trap contained inside her first answer, because she wanted the Green New Deal treated as historically significant when discussing political leadership, but treated as merely symbolic when Kennedy attached a price to the policies it represented. Kennedy did not need to claim that the resolution itself had written a $93 trillion check, because his larger point concerned the economic program attached to the vision and the gulf between moral certainty and practical explanation. He shifted the argument away from activists and policy professionals and toward retirees, families, and people living on fixed incomes, the voters who hear Washington announce transformations while wondering who ultimately receives the bill. Then he cited the remark attributed to her former chief of staff, who said the Green New Deal was not primarily a climate policy, but an effort to change the economy, using her own political circle to reinforce his criticism. The first achievement on the yellow pad was already bleeding credibility, not because Kennedy had shouted it down, but because he forced the claim to survive outside the language that had originally made it attractive. Then Kennedy moved to what he called her personal economy, the financial machinery operating behind the movement fueled by those celebrated $18 donations. The transition mattered because Ocasio-Cortez's political brand did not merely criticize wealth. It repeatedly presented her campaign as evidence that ordinary people could finance politics without becoming servants of corporations or elite donors. Kennedy opened a folder and began reading hotel expenditures from campaign filings, naming stays in Las Vegas, Tucson, San Juan, and other locations, while allowing the numbers to accumulate without dressing them in complicated legal terminology. According to the record, the campaign spent more than $53,000 on luxury hotels in 2025, and Kennedy immediately compared that spending with the financial pressure facing people in the district she represented. His point was not that campaign travel was automatically unlawful. When Ocasio-Cortez answered that such travel expenses were standard and legal, Kennedy explicitly separated legality from the issue he was prosecuting, honesty. That distinction allowed him to keep the attack exactly where he wanted it, because a campaign expenditure can comply with the law and still collide spectacularly with the moral identity used to persuade supporters to donate. Kennedy described ordinary contributors skipping necessities or squeezing another small amount out of a household budget because they believed their money was helping wage a political war against concentrated wealth, privilege, and oligarchy. Against that image, he placed luxury hotels, expensive travel, and the Fighting Oligarchy tour with Bernie Sanders, turning the campaign's own anti-elite language into a sarcastic caption for the lifestyle reflected in the expenditures. The record then points to nearly $50,000 in Puerto Rico, upscale meals, event costs, and a VIP suite connected to a Bad Bunny concert, all placed beside the repeated message that billionaires and economic excess represented the central corruption of American life. The contradiction Kennedy was building was not subtle. If your political power comes from condemning extravagance, every extravagant-looking campaign expense becomes more than a receipt. It becomes evidence against the character you have sold to your supporters. He pushed that contrast harder with the image of a politician traveling in ways ordinary donors could never afford, while asking those same donors to believe they were financing resistance to the privileged class. Kennedy's argument was intentionally moral rather than narrowly procedural, because procedural defenses are much easier when the accusation is simply that an expense appeared on a campaign filing. The harder question was whether the people sending $18 at a time would recognize their own values in a spending pattern involving luxury hotels, expensive meals, private travel, and high-end political events. Ocasio-Cortez could say the expenses were related to campaigning, and that answer might address compliance, but it did not erase the visual Kennedy wanted voters to hold in their heads. He was taking the language of working families, stripping away the slogans, and asking whether the movement looked quite as revolutionary when the invoices were placed beside the speeches. Then came 3 payments listed to Dr. Brian Bull totaling $18,725, classified on campaign filings as leadership training and consulting. Kennedy treated those entries as another test of transparency. He identified Bull as a Harvard-trained psychiatrist associated with ketamine therapy and questioned why payments to someone with that professional background had been described using language that suggested ordinary political consulting or leadership services. Ocasio-Cortez answered by refusing to discuss private health matters, but Kennedy's response was to insist that he was not asking about her health and was instead questioning how campaign expenditures had been labeled for public reporting. That distinction sharpened the pressure because the people contributing small amounts were being asked to trust not only how the money was spent, but how those expenditures were described when disclosed to federal regulators and the public. By this point, Kennedy had taken her celebrated $18 donation figure and transformed it from a symbol of grassroots purity into the accounting lens through which every hotel bill, travel charge, dinner, and consulting payment would now be judged. And yet, in the structure of Kennedy's attack, the money was still only preparation, because the second accomplishment written on the yellow pad carried consequences much larger than a hotel bill or a campaign filing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had said she was proud of standing up to Amazon, and unlike the Green New Deal argument, Kennedy could attach that claim to a specific project, a specific city, and a specific number of jobs that were supposed to arrive. The proposed second headquarters in Long Island City represented 25,000 jobs, the kind of jobs Kennedy argued could have given thousands of households access to salaries capable of changing rent payments, debt burdens, savings accounts, and long-term security. Ocasio-Cortez had presented opposition to the deal as proof that her district could not be bought with corporate subsidies, but Kennedy was about to present the same event as proof that political branding had been allowed to outrank economic opportunity. Once he started counting the jobs instead of the applause, the second line on that yellow pad was about to become far more dangerous than the first. Kennedy moved directly into the Amazon deal because this was the second achievement Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had personally chosen to place on the yellow pad, and unlike a resolution or a political slogan, this one came with a number that ordinary people could understand immediately: 25,000 jobs. In 2019, Amazon had announced plans for a second headquarters in Long Island City, Queens, bringing technology, engineering, administrative, and other professional positions that Kennedy framed as the kind of employment capable of changing a household rather than merely improving a politician's press coverage. According to the record, roughly 70% of New Yorkers supported the arrangement, a striking number in a city famous for disagreement. Yet Ocasio-Cortez became one of the most visible political opponents of the deal because she argued that billions of dollars in government incentives amounted to corporate welfare for one of the richest companies on the planet. Kennedy's attack was brutal precisely because he refused to debate whether Amazon deserved sympathy. He made the issue about the people who would have received paychecks, forcing the argument away from Jeff Bezos and back toward workers who might have benefited from those jobs. The result, as he presented it, was devastatingly simple. Amazon walked away, Virginia welcomed the investment, and Ocasio-Cortez celebrated an outcome Kennedy portrayed not as the defeat of corporate greed, but as the disappearance of 25,000 opportunities her constituents would never get to evaluate for themselves. That distinction became the heart of Kennedy's case because Ocasio-Cortez had described the Amazon fight as evidence that she could stand against concentrated corporate power, while Kennedy described the same fight as a politician sacrificing economic opportunity because opposition to Amazon strengthened her national brand. He pushed the argument towards single mothers working multiple shifts, veterans submitting applications without responses, families living paycheck to paycheck, and residents who did not have the luxury of treating 25,000 jobs as an abstract ideological exercise. In Kennedy's framing, those people did not need another press conference explaining why Amazon was morally suspect. They needed employers willing to offer salaries that could cover rent, groceries, transportation, insurance, and the 1,000 quiet expenses politicians rarely mention when they speak about economic justice. Ocasio-Cortez answered with a position she had taken from the beginning, that the deal amounted to handing billions in taxpayer subsidies to a trillion-dollar corporation. But Kennedy refused to allow the argument to stay at the level of corporate balance sheets. His counter was that the agreement also represented thousands of paychecks, and his accusation was unmistakable. She had chosen the satisfaction of winning a political fight over the uncertainty of allowing those jobs to exist. What made the attack harder to dismiss was that Kennedy did not rely solely on Republican criticism, because he reached for the words of Andrew Cuomo, then the Democratic governor of New York, who had been furious when the project collapsed. Kennedy quoted Cuomo's accusation that a small group of politicians had placed narrow political interests above their community, and the partisan shield Ocasio-Cortez normally could have raised suddenly became much thinner because the criticism had come from inside her own party. This was not a conservative commentator saying she hated business, not a Republican think tank trying to score a point, and not Kennedy manufacturing a hostile interpretation after the fact. It was a Democratic governor blaming political opposition for the loss of the project. That mattered because Ocasio-Cortez had made resistance to Amazon part of her identity, and Kennedy was now arguing that the achievement she celebrated had been condemned by members of the very coalition she belonged to. The second line on the yellow pad had therefore suffered the same fate as the first. The proud headline remained intact, but the practical result looked dramatically different once Kennedy forced the room to examine who actually gained and who actually lost. Then Ocasio-Cortez stopped playing defense, and for a moment the entire hearing tilted because she attacked Kennedy where he was most vulnerable, turning the discussion away from Queens and toward Louisiana. She pointed to Louisiana's low rankings in poverty, education, and healthcare outcomes, and challenged the right of a senator from one of America's poorest states to lecture her about serving struggling constituents. It was an effective political move because it did not require her to erase the Amazon numbers or answer every spending question. It simply forced Kennedy to confront the failures inside the state he represented, and the press immediately recognized that she had finally put him on uncomfortable ground. For several seconds, the momentum looked as though it had shifted back toward her, because this was the kind of counterattack that had repeatedly worked for Ocasio-Cortez in hostile exchanges: refuse the frame, expose the opponent's weakness, and make the critic defend himself instead. The Democratic side visibly responded to the change in energy, and Ocasio-Cortez once again looked like the politician who had built a national reputation by refusing to sit quietly while Republicans defined the terms of the argument. Kennedy did not deny the criticism, and that choice deprived Ocasio-Cortez of the fight she was expecting, because there was no defensive speech about Louisiana being secretly successful and no attempt to pretend that poverty, education, or health outcomes were imaginary. He acknowledged that Louisiana had serious problems, said he saw them directly when he returned home, and then made the distinction that restored control of the hearing. He admitted the failures of his state while she had listed the loss of 25,000 jobs as one of the achievements she was proudest of. The line worked because Kennedy was no longer defending Louisiana's record against New York's. He was comparing the way each politician responded to failure, placing admission on one side and political celebration on the other. His point was not that Louisiana had solved poverty because he had just conceded the opposite, but that he did not package those problems as victories and ask voters to applaud them. Ocasio-Cortez had launched what should have been a devastating counterpunch, yet Kennedy absorbed it, accepted the factual premise, and returned the argument to the question she still had not escaped, whether her celebrated accomplishments had materially improved the lives of the people she claimed to represent. From there, Kennedy accelerated, because the hearing was no longer about isolated controversies. He began connecting them into a pattern, arguing that the same contradiction appeared whenever Ocasio-Cortez's public rhetoric met the details of her own political operation. He started with the 2021 Met Gala, where she appeared in the now famous white dress carrying the words "Tax the Rich," a piece of political theater almost perfectly designed for photographs, social media, and the image of an insurgent entering one of America's most elite cultural events while criticizing the wealthy people surrounding her. Kennedy emphasized the reported $35,000 ticket value and then pointed to the bipartisan House Ethics Committee, finding which concluded that Ocasio-Cortez had impermissibly accepted gifts connected with her attendance. The attack was not that she had attended a glamorous event while advocating higher taxes on wealthy Americans, because politicians regularly appear in expensive rooms. Kennedy's point was that the moral symbolism became harder to defend once unpaid bills, gifts, and delayed reimbursements entered the record. The slogan on the dress said one thing to the cameras, while the financial details behind the appearance gave Kennedy another opportunity to argue that the public performance and the private conduct did not belong to the same political universe. He then focused on the designer Aurora James, founder of Brother Vellies, because the contradiction became even sharper when the person waiting to be paid was a black female entrepreneur operating the kind of business Ocasio-Cortez routinely described herself as fighting to protect. According to the record, costs connected with the dress, accessories, transportation, and other services were not fully settled until after ethics investigators began asking questions, turning what might have been dismissed as administrative sloppiness into another example Kennedy could place inside his larger argument about accountability. His sarcasm barely needed decoration. Ocasio-Cortez could stand under flashbulbs wearing "Tax the Rich," speak endlessly about supporting minority-owned businesses, and still leave the people who provided the goods and services waiting for payment until scrutiny arrived. Kennedy's accusation was that this was not simply hypocrisy in the cheap partisan sense, but a recurring system in which the message was always immediate, the benefits of the message were immediate, and responsibility arrived much later, usually after someone with a badge, a subpoena, or an ethics form started asking inconvenient questions. Every new receipt strengthened the same image he had been constructing since the $18 donation entered the conversation, because ordinary supporters were asked to trust the moral certainty of the brand, while the financial paperwork repeatedly required explanations after the fact. Then Kennedy moved from unpaid bills to money that was harder to follow, pointing to the claim that Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff moved $885,000 from political action committees into limited liability companies he personally owned or controlled. Kennedy explained the distinction in blunt, practical terms. Political committees disclose expenditures in ways designed for public scrutiny, while an LLC can make the trail less transparent. So shifting nearly $1 million from one structure into another naturally raised the question of why the money needed to travel somewhere voters could see less clearly. When scrutiny intensified, the chief of staff eventually resigned, while Ocasio-Cortez dismissed the controversy as conservative talking points. But Kennedy had already found the rhetorical weapon he wanted, because she had publicly demanded full transparency and zero tolerance for dark money in American politics. He held those principles against the arrangements surrounding her own political network and let the contrast do most of the damage, because condemning secretive political financing is easy when the secrecy belongs to an opponent, and far more uncomfortable when hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own operation disappear behind corporate structures. The people who had donated $18 because they believed they were financing a transparent grassroots revolution were now being asked, in Kennedy's framing, to accept that enormous sums could move into entities they could not easily inspect, while the politician who demanded sunlight from everybody else treated questions about her own operation as partisan noise. But Kennedy was not finished with campaign machinery because he turned from political money back toward the district itself, where the moral argument became much harder to hide behind compliance, language, or ideological disagreement. The record places poverty in her district at 18.6%, nearly 1 in 5 families with per capita income around $27,000, roughly $10,000 below the New York City average, meaning that the voters behind the speeches were living with precisely the economic pressure Ocasio-Cortez claimed to understand better than the Washington establishment. Kennedy described limited office hours, unanswered phones, constituents struggling to reach staff, and a town hall that lasted roughly 55 minutes while allowing only 6 questions from a district containing hundreds of thousands of people. Then came the detail designed to summarize the entire accusation in one image. After those 6 questions, she left in an SUV, while people still wanted access to the representative whose political identity depended on being unusually accessible to ordinary working-class residents. For Kennedy, that was the pattern stripped of all decoration, relentless visibility on national television, endless rhetorical intimacy with the working class, and constituents at home still waiting for somebody in the office to pick up the phone. Kennedy stayed on the district because this was where every other argument eventually had to end, not in Washington speeches, not in campaign slogans, and not in television clips, but in the daily experience of the people Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been elected to represent. He cited the complaints from constituents who said she had done little for the community and who compared her to an absentee landlord, a phrase that cut directly against the image of a representative supposedly rooted in the struggles of ordinary residents. The accusation was not that she never appeared anywhere because Ocasio-Cortez was one of the most visible political figures in the country. The accusation was that national visibility and local availability were not the same thing, and that the people who helped build her platform were sometimes the very people left waiting for access. Kennedy kept returning to that gap because it gave him a way to connect campaign spending, political branding, Amazon, and constituent service without treating them as unrelated controversies. In his framing, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Enormous attention flowed outward toward national influence, while the district that supplied the political identity was repeatedly asked to accept explanations, delays, and symbolism in place of measurable results. Then Kennedy moved to the personal biography Ocasio-Cortez had used throughout her rise, because biography had always been one of the strongest parts of her appeal. She had presented herself as a bartender from the Bronx, a working-class outsider who understood rent pressure, service work, economic insecurity, and the frustration of watching wealthy institutions shape public policy from a distance. Kennedy did not claim that working as a bartender was false, and he did not argue that moving between different parts of New York was improper. Instead, he focused on the way the story had been compressed into a cleaner political identity than the underlying biography allowed. He pointed out that she had grown up in Yorktown Heights in Westchester County with access to schools and surroundings far removed from the harsher economic conditions associated with the Bronx image she emphasized politically. That distinction was not illegal, scandalous, or disqualifying by itself, but Kennedy treated the repeated presentation of one side of the biography as another example of a political brand being constructed more carefully than the full record. The force of that argument came from accumulation, because by then Kennedy had already spent most of the hearing showing the room versions of the same contrast in different forms. The Green New Deal was sold as sweeping transformation. But when cost entered the discussion, it became a non-binding resolution that technically spent nothing. Standing up to Amazon was sold as a victory over corporate welfare, but Kennedy framed it as the loss of 25,000 jobs and billions of dollars in wages that would never reach the workers who might have benefited. Small dollar fundraising was sold as proof of grassroots purity, but the hearing had already moved through luxury hotels, expensive travel, consulting payments, Met Gala expenses. delayed bills, and the movement of hundreds of thousands of dollars through LLCs, the Bronx identity was sold as proof of intimate connection with struggling constituents, but Kennedy now placed Westchester upbringing, limited office access, short town halls, and complaints from local residents beside that image. None of these points depended on the same technical argument, yet Kennedy's entire strategy was to make them look like products of the same political habit. The message was always cleaner than the details. He then softened his tone again, because disappointment could be more damaging than outrage after the evidence had already been laid out. Kennedy said that telling America she was a bartender from the Bronx was a good story, and he acknowledged that people believed it because the story fit perfectly with the larger political character Ocasio-Cortez had cultivated. The real criticism was not that she had lived somewhere else as a child, but that she repeatedly chose the version of her background most useful for presenting herself as a direct product of the hardship she discussed on camera. Kennedy argued that this was a choice made over and over again, not an accidental misunderstanding created by one interview or one careless sentence, and he connected that choice with the larger theme of image management he had been building throughout the hearing. By that point, the hearing was no longer a collection of policy disputes. Kennedy had turned it into a prosecution of credibility in which every earlier answer was being measured against what he described as the less flattering reality underneath it. And that brought him back to the yellow pad sitting in front of him, the same pad he had used at the beginning when Ocasio-Cortez confidently listed the 3 achievements she considered most important. The significance of that pad had changed during the hearing because at first it looked like nothing more than a senator taking notes, but now every line carried the weight of the examination that followed. Green New Deal, Amazon, Medicare for all, and working families. 3 phrases in blue ink, all supplied by Ocasio-Cortez herself, all written down before Kennedy began laying out the material he believed contradicted them. He had not selected obscure controversies and called them the center of her record. He had asked her to define the center of her own record and then spent the hearing testing whether those claims survived scrutiny. That was why returning to the pad mattered so much. He was about to eliminate the argument that the entire hearing had been built around Republican priorities rather than her own definition of success. Kennedy picked up the yellow pad and reminded the room that he had asked Ocasio-Cortez at the beginning what she was most proud of, and that she had answered without hesitation. He read back the first answer, the Green New Deal, and summarized the attack he had already made against it. A sweeping economic vision attached to enormous projected costs, while remaining a non-binding resolution that had never become the transformative law its supporters spoke about as though it already existed. The contradiction Kennedy wanted the audience to remember was not merely ideological. It was the political convenience of treating the plan as historically consequential when credit was available and legally toothless when responsibility was demanded. 7 years in Congress had passed, and the plan that occupied the first position on her own list had not become the governing transformation that her rhetoric had promised. Kennedy did not need to add another accusation at this stage because the hearing had already supplied the context, and the first line on the pad now sounded less like an accomplishment than an unresolved claim. Then he read the second answer. Amazon and the numbers returned immediately, because numbers had always been the most damaging part of that dispute. Ocasio-Cortez had described the decision as standing up to a corporation seeking billions in public incentives, but Kennedy reduced the aftermath to 25,000 jobs that did not arrive and billions in wages that, in his framing, would never circulate through the households that might have earned them. He again brought in the criticism from Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo because it prevented the argument from being dismissed as nothing more than partisan outrage from the Republican side of the room. What Ocasio-Cortez had presented at the beginning as proof of courage was now being reread as proof that ideological satisfaction had been purchased with opportunities belonging to other people. The second achievement, therefore, carried an even harsher problem than the first. The Green New Deal could be criticized for failing to become law, while Amazon could be criticized for producing a concrete outcome. Kennedy insisted had made the district poorer in opportunity. Then came the third line, the broad promise to fight for Medicare for all, student debt relief, working families, and a government that served ordinary people rather than billionaires. This was the safest answer politically because it was not tied to one project or one moment, but Kennedy treated that breadth as the weakness, arguing that years of fighting, speeches, interviews, rallies, and legislation still had to be translated into results if the word achievement was going to mean anything. According to the record, almost none of the legislation associated with her record had become law, allowing Kennedy to draw a sharp distinction between activity and accomplishment, between being visible in a fight and actually producing an outcome that changed someone's life. Fighting every day may describe effort, he argued, but effort was not the same thing as a result, and the hearing had been organized from the beginning around that exact distinction. When he set the yellow pad back on the table, the three things Ocasio-Cortez had selected as the strongest evidence for her own record had been turned into three separate examples Kennedy could use to argue that rhetoric had repeatedly outrun delivery. That was the point where the atmosphere in the room changed again because Kennedy had finished reviewing the individual controversies and was now returning to the simple question that had started everything. He reminded Ocasio-Cortez that these were not achievements he had chosen for her and not accusations created by a hostile committee staff. They were the answers she herself had given when asked what she wanted the country to remember about her work. He had spent the hearing moving through money, jobs, ethics, biography, campaign structures, and constituent service, but all of it had been preparation for a much narrower test. If the purpose of representation was to improve the lives of the people who sent someone to Washington, then Kennedy was about to ask her to stop talking about movements, bills, battles, headlines, and ideological victories and identify the human result underneath all of them. The yellow pad stayed open between them, three blue lines visible on the page, while Kennedy leaned forward and prepared to ask the one question that would force every speech of the afternoon into a single answer. Kennedy leaned forward and stripped away every remaining escape route because after 12 minutes of arguments about plans, donors, campaign spending, Amazon, ethics, biography, and constituent service, he no longer wanted another policy explanation or another speech about intentions. He asked Ocasio-Cortez to name one person in her district whose life was better because of something she had actually done. Not a proposal, not a viral clip, not a headline, not a movement, but one person, one family, one life that had materially changed because she had been there. The question was almost aggressively simple, which was exactly why it was so dangerous. Because complicated political language could not hide inside it, and ideological framing could not expand it into something easier to answer. Ocasio-Cortez opened her mouth, stopped, looked down, looked back up, took a breath, and still did not produce the answer Kennedy had demanded. The silence lasted 12 seconds, long enough to stop being a pause and become the central fact of the moment. Kennedy did not rush to fill that silence because there was no reason to rescue her from it, and every additional second strengthened the argument he had spent the hearing constructing. He quietly said that he could name 12 people in Louisiana, not as a new policy lecture, but as a contrast between his demand for specificity and the absence of a name from the person who had just spent the afternoon describing herself as a champion of working families. The room stayed still while the question hung there, and the silence became more damaging than another accusation because it appeared to confirm the exact distinction Kennedy had been drawing between fighting publicly and delivering privately. 7 years of national visibility, endless speeches, repeated claims of economic justice, and a political identity built around direct connection to ordinary people had been compressed into one request for one human example. The answer did not arrive, and Kennedy treated that absence as the clearest summary of the entire hearing. Then he began stacking the earlier facts one last time, not to reopen each dispute, but to show what the accumulated pattern looked like when all the pieces were placed side by side. He returned to the more than $53,000 in hotel spending, placing those expenditures beside struggling residents in Parkchester and other parts of the district who were being asked to believe every $18 donation was fueling a movement for them. He returned to the Amazon deal and the 25,000 jobs that he argued had been pushed away and then celebrated as a political victory, turning what Ocasio-Cortez called resistance to corporate welfare into what Kennedy called a decision that denied working families an opportunity. He returned to the Bronx identity and contrasted it with her upbringing in Westchester, not because Westchester itself was a scandal, but because he saw the polished biography as another example of selecting the version of reality that served the political brand best. He returned to constituent access, the short town hall, the unanswered calls, and the image of residents still waiting while their representative left through the back in an SUV. That was when Kennedy delivered the line the hearing had been building toward from the beginning. Everything she was most proud of had either hurt the people she represented or never happened in the way she claimed. The Green New Deal had not become the sweeping law its rhetoric suggested. The Amazon fight had been followed by the loss of a project carrying 25,000 jobs. And the broader promise to fight for working families had produced in Kennedy's argument far more national attention than concrete legislative success. He then sharpened it into 6 words, telling Ocasio-Cortez that she had not fought for those people, she had used them. And the accusation landed precisely because he had spent the previous 12 minutes tying every earlier point back to the people behind the slogans. There was no celebration from Kennedy, no theatrical smile, no attempt to turn the exchange into a victory lap, because the more restrained he became, the more final the moment appeared. The chairman moved toward the next member, and under the ordinary rhythm of congressional hearings, this should have been the moment when someone on Ocasio-Cortez's side stepped in and gave her room to recover. That rescue never came, and this became the second silence that defined the afternoon. The senior Democrat on the panel looked at his papers, looked toward the microphone, looked toward Ocasio-Cortez, and then told the chairman that he had no questions for the witness at that time. In Washington, where hearings often work like alternating rounds of attack and protection, such a refusal mattered because allies usually use their time to redirect the discussion, introduce favorable facts, challenge the opposing member's framing, or at least create 30 seconds of breathing room. Ocasio-Cortez looked toward him as if waiting for exactly that kind of lifeline, but the lifeline never appeared, and the absence of defense was more humiliating than another hostile question because it suggested that nobody nearby wanted to spend political capital repairing what had just happened. Kennedy gathered his papers, placed the yellow pad on top of the folder, straightened the stack, and yielded his time without adding anything else. The hearing continued, but the remaining proceedings already felt secondary because the defining image had been created. 3 answers in blue ink on a yellow pad and 12 seconds of silence after a demand for one concrete life improved. Ocasio-Cortez remained seated with the opening statement she had delivered earlier still in front of her, the same statement about inequality in working families that had sounded completely different before Kennedy forced those broad claims through a much narrower test. On his side of the table, the yellow pad remained open with Green New Deal, Amazon, and Medicare for All written on it, the 3 achievements she had volunteered before, knowing they would become the structure of the attack against her. What began as evidence of confidence now looked in the logic of Kennedy's examination, like evidence supplied by the target herself. By morning, that piece of paper was becoming one of the most photographed objects associated with the hearing because it visually captured the entire sequence without requiring another speech. Ocasio-Cortez left without stopping for reporters, another departure from the public combativeness that had defined so much of her political career. Reporters called after her while staff stayed close, but there was no extended response, no immediate counterattack, no attempt to reclaim the narrative before the elevator doors closed. That silence was politically important because Ocasio-Cortez had built a reputation on speed, certainty, and the ability to turn hostile moments into content of her own. Yet this time, there was nothing offered to compete with Kennedy's framing. Later that evening, no major Democratic leader issued the kind of immediate public defense that might normally follow a partisan confrontation of this scale. No coordinated accusation of unfairness appeared to overwhelm the footage, and the absence of visible rescue was interpreted not as neutrality, but as a judgment that defending her was not worth the cost. That night, the clip spread rapidly, but the portion that mattered most was not the hotels, the LLCs, the Met Gala, or even Amazon, because scandals require context, while silence requires almost none. Viewers could watch Kennedy ask for one person whose life had improved, watch Ocasio-Cortez search for an answer, and count the seconds themselves without needing a policy paper or a campaign filing to understand why the moment was politically lethal. 12 seconds became the compressed symbol of the entire hearing because they seemed to represent the space between the identity she had projected and the evidence Kennedy demanded. Every speech about being a fighter, every claim of standing with workers, every declaration about billionaires and ordinary families suddenly looked vulnerable to the same basic question: what concrete result could be named immediately when the slogans were taken away? That was why the silence traveled farther than any individual allegation, because people did not have to agree with Kennedy on every policy issue to understand what an unanswered question looked like. The argument returned to the $18 donor, an ordinary supporter sitting at home in the district who had believed Ocasio-Cortez represented something different from the political class he distrusted. He had sent a small amount because the amount itself carried, meaning because $18 was not corporate money or a billionaire's check, but a personal act of trust from someone who believed the campaign understood people living close to the edge. He watched Kennedy write down the 3 achievements, watched each of those achievements become a target, watched the silence after the final question, and watched the Democratic side decline to intervene. When the hearing ended, there was no complicated conclusion left for him to reach, only the feeling that he had paid for a story about representation and discovered that the story did not survive inspection. Across the country, the people who had doubted Ocasio-Cortez for years were left with the same image, not a shouting match or a partisan slogan, but a yellow pad, 3 answers, 12 seconds of silence, and the belief that the doubt they had carried all along had finally been spoken out loud.